Well, hello everyone. Today's video is about Vikings, which I know are just about everyone's favorite thing to talk about. Unfortunately for us, there's been a lot of upset comments that have been directed towards us regarding Viking combat abilities, but today I'm hoping to dispel a couple of the myths about Vikings. Now, in future videos, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain precisely why certain forces would either win or lose against Vikings in set context. One of the battles that caused us a lot of problems was people debating as to whether or not Vikings would actually lose against Spartans. So today I'm going to explain a little bit about what a Viking is. First off, the romanticization of the term Viking is a bit of a problem in history. Viking in and of itself is not actually a noun, it's a verb. This is something that comes from Vikinger, which literally means to raid. A Viking was not a person that was a raider, that was a professional warrior. It was an action that a Norseman might take when raiding for loot, whether this be food, slaves, or other kinds of goods that could be traded. Now, most Vikings were actually farmers, fishermen, tradesmen, etc. In fact, the action of raiding to go a Viking was actually something that would be used to gain loot that then would go to another place to trade. Even in the same country, one might loot one county only to travel 50 miles downstream and trade with the inhabitants there. This is something that was seen all across England. Now, when one considers Viking equipment, one of the key things that confuses people is that they think of Vikings as heavily armed warriors, equipped with double-headed battle axes and heavy armor. This is not really true. Double-headed axes were not something that were commonly used in war. It just wasn't something that was typically practical. Instead, there could be two-handed battle axes, but this was something that would have a single edge. Even on top of that, most Vikings did not actually have heavy armor. Heavy armor in this sense would be considered, say, a mail hauberk. Most common was actually something called a gambeson. Now, what a gambeson was multiple layers of quilted cloth that were sewn together. This is something that could fairly easily turn a blade, but was also somewhat weak to puncturing. So if someone had, say, a lance or a arrow or crossbow bolt, this is something that would penetrate gambeson quite easily, but it could resist the slashing that would come from basic weapons quite nicely. So, what Vikings typically did when they went to war is they would engage in a tactic that was known as the shield wall. This was something that was closest to the phalanx of the ancient Greeks. The reason that they did this is that most Vikings would engage in combat as a type of levy. You would draft men into war. They would leave their farms, they would leave their fishing villages, their trade posts, etc., to be called up to their local warlords' call to arms, and they would go to war. The reason why phalanxes, shield walls, and other formations were used was not because it was an overwhelmingly effective tactic, but it was because you could take men that had almost no experience in war, men who were not professional soldiers and would rather flee from battle, and you could lock them into a position from which there was no ability to flee. After all, it is stated in history that there is no better way to make your enemy fight harder than to corner them. You always want to leave a way to escape. This is something that is applied to your enemies, as well as something that applies to your allies, which is one of the key reasons why this formation would be used, so that you could lock peasants into place and they would be able to resist a charge. Again, this is something that we would want to address. So we've talked about tactics, but what about equipment? There is a, as I said, romanticization that is associated with Vikings, where they would use double-handed battle axes, swords, etc. But one must understand that the sword was a rich man's weapon. Iron and steel, etc., this was not something that was a tool that could be easily afforded by the common man. As a result, the most common weapon that was used by the Vikings was in fact the spear. I know that may be a little bit hard to believe when you look at movies and books and video games and depictions, but this is actually the case. The spear was one of the most cheap, and yet effective tools by which you could equip your armies. At the same time, Viking soldiers were not professionals. They used weapons that had been passed down by their forefathers, that were used as their tools of trade. Spears were something that were used for home defense and also for hunting. This is something that you would typically see in war. At the same time, some men would go into battle simply as javelin men or bowmen, etc., serving as light infantry. This is also something that you would see in war. But again, one has to understand that soldiers for Vikings were not professionals, nor were they heavily armed monstrosities. Now, I hope this video, which though I know it has been a little bit short, has enlightened you on a bit about Viking wars and tactics. I want you to understand that this right here merely serves as a preface to what is to come. We've received far too many questions, far too many criticisms about what would happen if certain warriors went up against other warriors in battle. So this video right here is to serve as a gap that I hope explains a bit of context behind what Vikings were before we talk about what happens when they go up against others, namely the Spartans, which is the next video to come. My name is Stakuyi, thank you for watching, and I do hope to see you all next time. Goodbye.